So good morning and welcome to this session on how far should we go to protect hate speech. There's some housekeeping messages we need to provide before we get started. I'll do that now. This is a message from South by Southwest. South by Southwest is committed to creating an enjoyable and memorable experience for all of its attendees and speakers. To help create such an environment, we kindly ask that all participants on the Online Harassment Summit act responsibly and treat each other with respect, empathy, and compassion. South by Southwest reserves the right to revoke South by Southwest entry credentials from any participant whose conduct is deemed by Southwest or APD to be inappropriate, disorderly, or offensive. Lastly, personal items are prohibited from being left unattended. It doesn't look like you have a problem with saving seats, so we can just surpass that. But there'll be no exceptions, and we appreciate your cooperation in this. So, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'm Deborah Lauder. I'm the Senior Vice President of Policy and Programs for the Anti-Defamation League. We're one of the leading civil rights human relations organizations in the country. We've been calling ourselves a 103-year-old startup, and we actually have been very involved in the issue of online hate. We issued our first reports actually in the 1980s. We have been convening a working group in Silicon Valley for a number of years with some of the panelists up here to confront the issue of online hate. I would recommend that you look at our website, adl.org/cybersafety, where we have posted our best practices. I think they're very instructive, and we'll be talking about some of them today. So why are we all here today? This is a very important topic. As we all know, what the internet has done for society, it's brought us all together, it's made us communicate better, but those freedoms that we have on the internet, also there's the side of ugly and hate speech. And so, today we're going to examine that. We are so fortunate to have, this is the A-team, I will tell you, on this whole issue today. I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order, and then we will engage in some conversation here, and then we're going to open it up to you in the audience to generate questions as well. So first we have Monica Bickert. Monica is Facebook's head of product policy. She's responsible for the rules for how people can use Facebook and its services, such as what they can post on the site and how they can target ads. She's an American lawyer who has spent more than a decade as a federal criminal prosecutor before joining Facebook in 2012. So please join me in welcoming Monica Bickert. Next, we'd like to introduce Juniper Downs, here to my right. Juniper heads up policy for YouTube and works on controversial content issues across Google's products. She started her legal career at the ACLU and then was a government lawyer, and she continues to grapple with cutting-edge speech issues in her current role. Jeff Rosen, you can figure out which one Jeff is. He is the president and chief executive officer of the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. He's a professor at George Washington University Law School and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a contributing editor at The Atlantic. Jeff is a highly regarded journalist, and he's received many accolades, including from the LA Times, which called him, quote, the nation's most widely read and influential legal commentator. Jeff's a scholar on the Supreme Court, and he's got a new book coming out, I'm going to plug, Louis Brandeis' American Prophet, and it's coming out in June. And he's also co-edited Constitution 3.0, Freedom and Technological Change. So great to have you here, Jeff. Thank you for joining us. And then finally we have Lee Rowland. She's a staff attorney with the ACLU's Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project. Lee has extensive experience as a litigator, lobbyist, and a public speaker. She serves as the lead counsel in federal First Amendment cases in federal and state court, and she also briefs and blogs on topics involving involving student and public employee speech, obscenity, and the Communications Decency Act, the intersection between speech and privacy as well. So Lee serves as an adjunct clinical professor at NYU's NYU's Laws, Technology, Law, and Policy Clinic, and she's a member of the New York Bar Association's Communication and Media Law Committee. So as you can see, as I said, this is the A game in terms of grappling with the whole issue of online speech, hate speech. So I think we need to start with the basic, what are we talking about here? And so I'm going to turn over to you, Lee, to say what is hate speech?
Well, how unfair to suggest that that's a basic question. If we can unravel it in an hour, I'll be immensely impressed. Okay. So first of all, thanks everybody for being here. It's a beautiful day, and you guys are policy wonks and good citizens enough to sit in and talk about hate speech, so kudos. What is hate speech? That is the million-dollar question. When we are talking about threats, when we're talking about harassment, we use those words. That isn't hate speech, right? Hate speech is something altogether more free-floating and undefined. I was trying myself to, I was challenging myself last night to come up with what I think my definition of hate speech is. And it's a little bit snarky, and I don't mean it that way, but before I give what I think my definition is, I want to tell you I Googled hate speech in the news over just the last month to give a few examples of hate speech being cited by people. A police officer in New York objected to a child's art that was posted in a municipal building because it cited Black Lives Matter. The cop said this was obvious hate speech against police and should be removed. More broadly, Joe Scarborough, who is a host on MSNBC, I believe, and a former politician, called the Black Lives Matter movement more broadly as responsible for an avalanche of hate speech against cops. Martin O'Malley, who I think was a contender for the Democratic nomination, called Donald Trump someone who engaged in hate speech for calling Mr. O'Malley a disgusting, little, weak, pathetic baby. And in New Jersey, a girl was a teenager and high school student was pulled into a disciplinary proceeding for posting her thoughts that ran against Israeli foreign policy on Facebook. One of her colleagues basically reported her for, quote, hate speech. I suspect that most people in this room wouldn't, on a gut level, consider any of those things to be hate speech. But what those have in common, besides being perhaps demonstrably insane applications of the term hate speech, is that all of those claims to hate speech were made by people who were at one point government officials, in all four of those examples. And I'm a constitutional lawyer, so I frequently think about hate speech as this free-floating term that grants, in my mind, far too much power to government officials. But we don't live in a sterile land anymore, right, where our speech happens just in public forums, on soapboxes in parks. We live in a world where our speech is predominantly moving to digital platforms online that are run by private entities that themselves have rights to decide what their platforms look like, what they want their audiences and clients to see and to be. And so I won't do my straw man constitutional routine, but I still think it's fair to say from those examples and how I think about hate speech, and here's my definition: it is speech that is fully protected by the Constitution, but you don't think it should be. And so the really big philosophical question, that's my definition, I welcome anyone to challenge it, but I think the big philosophical question we have to grapple with at this panel is, this is kind of norms 2.0, right? We know how it shakes out when government is the one deciding what hate speech is. The First Amendment forbids that. The First Amendment protects hate speech. That's why it doesn't have a more precise definition, like threats or harassment. And so now we have massive platforms for speech that are non-governmental. So we basically have another chance to strike this balance. And I think that's both terrifying and exciting in a sense, because it is an opportunity for us to figure out how we want to treat each other online in a way where the First Amendment does not necessarily apply. So I think reasonable people can have very different views on that. Unsurprisingly, my view in the answer that this panel asks is pretty damn far, that there is a huge value in protecting hate speech, not simply as a constitutional value, but as one that allows us to respond to speech, engage in more speech, challenge that speech, know that ideas are out there rather than pretend that they're not. But my main point is, I think censoring hate speech, defining hate speech, targeting, taking down hate speech is a messy business, and that's just the truth. So I hope we all keep that in mind, because for every person in here who's pretty confident that they know who the good guys and the bad guys are and what hate looks like to them, You have to remember that there are cops who say Black Lives Matter is hate speech. You have to remember that there are school administrators who believe saying something against Israeli foreign policy is hate speech, and that's something we all have to grapple with. It's very much in the eye of the beholder or the ear of the listener, and I think whenever anyone crafts policies, whether the government or Facebook or Google, they have to keep in mind that this is refracted through the eyes and the ears of millions of listeners, and it's very hard to assume that everyone is going to be on the same page about what that looks like.
So thanks, Lee, because I think you did a brilliant job of articulating why this subject is, in your words, messy and important for us to talk about. So let me read Facebook's community standards defining hate speech. So it's Facebook will removes hate speech, which includes content that directly attacks people based on their race, ethnicity, national origin, religious affiliation, sexual orientation, sex, gender, or gender identity, or serious disabilities or diseases. So, Monica, my question to you is, how do you come up with those policies?
Thank you. Lee's right. There's not one universal definition of hate speech. And when services like Google or Facebook or Twitter think about what our policy should be, there's not one single source that provides us with an answer. What we have to consider is what is best for the people who are in our community, the Facebook community. We have roughly 1.6 billion people using Facebook on a regular basis, and more than 80% of those are outside the United States. And that's a shocking statistic to some people, but what it demonstrates is that this is really a global platform. It's a global service, and you have people around the world. Lee pointed out that people in this room will have different ideas about what hate speech should be. When you think about the different countries and the different cultures that are represented in the Facebook community, you can imagine there's a very broad spectrum of ideas about what's okay and what's not okay. What we focus on is our mission. Our mission is to give people a place to connect with one another and to share what's important to them. We know that people won't do that if they don't feel safe. You're not going to share photos of a family member or share your opinion about something if you don't think it's a safe place. So for us, we will remove any content that is attacking people based on these protected characteristics. Now, that does not mean that we will remove content that is offensive or that criticizes institutions. You can certainly you can post in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. You can criticize the foreign policy of any country on Facebook. You can criticize institutions, religions, and you can engage in robust political conversation. But what you can't do is cross the line into attacking a person or a group of people based on the protected characteristic. We draw that line because we think that's what we need to help people feel safe in our community and be willing to share themselves.
So let me just follow up with that. So explain the difference if you can't attack a person based on the religion, but you can attack religions. How do you make that distinction? Maybe give us an example.
And actually, you're pointing to something that's quite tricky for us, which is when we enforce these policies, that is often where the real difficulty is. Crafting the policy, as Lee pointed out, crafting the policy is tricky, especially because we're so global. But the really hard part is figuring out how we can enforce those policies when we receive more than 1 million reports per day of violations on Facebook. Anytime that you report something on Facebook, that comes into a team of real people that are looking at the content that's been reported and applying our policies to it. So there are two tricky things there. One is, how do we take this policy and say, how do we differentiate between criticizing a foreign policy and criticizing a person based on nationality? The other thing is that we're not going to have a lot of context. The content that gets reported comes into a person who's literally seeing that content in front of him or her on a screen and having to make that decision, not really knowing what the relationship is between the speaker and the listener in a particular case, or how the conversation developed before that post happened. So we do our best to just look at the actual content in the post or whatever's been reported. If somebody says, this country is terrible, that's okay. If somebody says, the people of this nationality are evil, that's something we'll remove. I point to that example because it gets right to the edge of where these two worlds collide, what's okay and what's not okay. And when you think about it in a particular example, saying, I'm just going to pick the US, saying the US is evil is something we would allow on Facebook. Saying Americans are evil is something we wouldn't allow. And when you think about it in that term, in a specific example, you think, well, I don't know that that's the right place to draw the line. But when you think about it in terms of our mission and what we need to make Facebook a safe place where people are comfortable sharing, the one comment is about a country. The other comment is attacking people. And if you're on Facebook and you're using that, that's going to feel a little more personal to you. And that's why we draw the line there.
Thank you. So, Juniper, how does Google, YouTube, all your products approach the same issue?
Thank you, Deborah. So, as Monica noted, services like YouTube and Facebook are these amazing global platforms which have provided people around the world with unprecedented levels of access to information, opportunities for people who in the old media world wouldn't have had a chance to create content and broadcast it to the world, to share content across borders. And really have provided a free expression platform that has enabled people to grow businesses and brands, for citizen journalists to thrive. They really have created tremendous benefit to the world. But with that scale and reach comes real challenges about how we deal with content that is uploaded by the over 1 billion unique monthly visitors that come to YouTube every month. And we have 400 hours of video uploaded to YouTube every minute. So the scale is truly tremendous. There are two parts to how we deal with content, so I just want to lay this out clearly from the start. The first is that we do have a legal removals process. So Lee gave an excellent explanation of the way that US law deals with hate speech, but there obviously are hate speech laws around the world that look at this issue very differently. So we do have a process to receive requests to restrict content pursuant to local laws, and we evaluate those requests. We have a team that looks at each and every one. And when content violates a local law, we are able to restrict it for the relevant jurisdiction. But we also have developed a set of content policies that set the rules of the road for YouTube. And even though we are a company that is very committed to free expression and access to information, it's not anything goes. And the way that we develop these policies, our policy isn't that different than what Deb read for Facebook, but the detail is really important here, so I'll just kind of share the language. We don't allow content that incites violence or that has the primary purpose of promoting hatred on the basis of the similar list of core characteristics that Deb read earlier. And the way we enforce those policies is primarily through community policing, where we have our users submitting flags to us that are reviewed by a global team 24/7. In 2014, we removed over 14 million videos for violation of YouTube's policies. That's all of our policies. And we think it's really important to have a responsible framework to deal with issues like hate speech and harassment. We also think it's important to give tools to our users to play a role in setting the tone that they want, particularly in conversation around videos they're uploading to the platform. So we introduced comment moderation tools, which do a few things. One is that individual creators can submit a list of words that they may not want to appear in comments to their videos. And those comments that have those words in them will go into a pre-moderation queue where the creator has to approve them before they would go live on the platform. Similar to certain users, if a creator is consistently getting comments they don't like from a particular user, they can tell us they would like to be able to look at those comments before they go live. These are things we would never want to do as a platform. We certainly don't have particular words we would ever outlaw on YouTube, but we think that creators should have some control over the space and the conversation happening around content they upload to the platform, and we're working on kind of expanding those tools. Just the last thing that I want to note is that though we believe in having responsible policies around this, at the end of the day, as Lee said in her opening remarks, the problem isn't that people are saying offensive things online. The problem is that people still feel hate, and people still feel permission to be hateful, and these are real world issues. So we also think, how can we be part of doing the hearts and minds work necessary to grapple with these complex social problems of people still feeling hateful and acting hateful today. So we invest a lot in counter speech as well, in parallel to our policies, and thinking about how can we build up the ecosystem so that people are comfortable stepping up and challenging hateful content, satirizing it, speaking back, refuting it, and having robust dialogue on the platform.
Right, thank you. So, Jeff, let's turn to you. You've written that Facebook, Google, and Twitter have more power over speech than any king, president, or Supreme Court justice, but they're not bound by the Constitution. Should they be?
Well, first I have to say how incredibly intimidated and honored I am to be sitting next to the two most powerful women in the world when it comes to free speech. And it's true that I wrote that more than a decade ago, and that idea that Facebook and Google and the people who decide about free speech have more power than any king, president, or Supreme Court justice originally described Nicole Wong at Google. And I remember well a conference at South by Southwest about a decade ago where I interviewed Wong about this incredible power that the platforms have by necessity, because they are the place where people speak today, and yet they aren't bound by the Constitution. And I've thought hard about this over the past 10 years, and all of us have appeared on panels together, and we've gotten to know each other. And perhaps I'm influenced by having come to know Monica and Juniper and the Twitter people and how they're actually applying these policies. But I have to say that on reflection, I think the answer to the question is yes. They are basically doing about as good a job as could be expected given the alternatives. Now that seems paradoxical, because in the American constitutional tradition, the idea trust the government or trust the power that has control over speech is not a constitutional principle. The founders of the Constitution wanted to divide power and constrain government to prevent it from influencing speech in any way. And as Lee so correctly described, the American free speech tradition constitutionally is the most protective in the entire world. As Lee described it, in America, you can only ban speech if it's intended to and likely to incite imminent violence. And that extraordinarily protective principle comes from a beautiful opinion by my hero, Louis Brandeis, who I describe in a riveting book that, as you said, will be published on June 1st, Louis D. Brandeis, American Prophet. But I want you to read his incredible opinion in the Whitney case, where he set forth this idea that because America has so much faith in the power of deliberation to promote truth, that the best counsel for evil ideas is good ones, and that counter speech, not repression, is necessary for American democracy. So that's the American constitutional tradition. Now, if you want to learn more about it, here's another plug, but it's a meaningful one. I have the honor for, to work at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. We've just created this incredible online tool that unites the top liberal and conservative scholars in America to write about every clause of the Constitution. So you can log on the Interactive Constitution, interactiveconstitution.org, and you can look at the free speech clause, and you can see Jeff Stone and Eugene Volokh, nominated by the Federalist Society, the leading conservative organization, and the American Constitution Society, the leading liberal organization, describing both what they agree about and what they disagree about free speech. And you can do that for any part of the Constitution. And there you can educate yourself and learn, as Volokh and Stone describe, how circumscribed the exceptions for speech are in America. In order to ban speech, you can restrict defamation, truth, threats, fighting words, obscenity, child pornography, commercial advertising, but that's about it. And without, if it's not within those categories, it has to be protected. I'm excited to announce that the College Board has just decided to make this incredible tool a centerpiece of the new AP U.S. History and Government curriculum. We want to bring it to every student in America. And this modeling of bringing together liberals and conservatives to talk about what they agree and disagree is our notion of combating the polarization that is so rampant in society today. But then, as you heard Monica so well describe, Facebook and Juniper describe her policies as well. Facebook and Google do not precisely track the First Amendment. Facebook bans hate speech that criticizes groups or people. Google bans hate speech that is intended to promote hatred primarily on the basis of these protected characteristics. So on Facebook and Google, there are certain kinds of hate speech that would be protected under the First Amendment, but that nevertheless Google and Facebook have decided, because they're communities and not civic spaces, they want to restrict. Nevertheless, I think Google and Facebook are doing a really good job at applying these policies in the face of pressures that did not exist when I began writing about this 10 years ago. Take the example, just one concrete example, the Innocence of the Muslims video. Remember that a few years ago? It was said that this video was causing the riots in Benghazi. And President Obama and the President of Egypt called on Google and Facebook to remove it. Well, it later turned out that the video didn't cause the riots. It had been online in Arabic for months before. But Google and Facebook looked at their policies and decided that because the video criticized a religious leader, Muhammad, but not a religion, namely Islam, it had to stay up. And that proved to be a better decision on balance than that President Obama and the President of Egypt were making. Now, what's new in the free speech debate is tremendous pressures in America to adopt a more European style of regulation toward hate speech. And we can talk about this in the next round of questions. But Europe, unlike America, allows and requires the banning of hate speech, speech that offends people's dignity or honor. And the new European right to be forgotten, which I'll talk about in the next round, expresses that view. Here in America, too, we're seeing claims to restrict speech based on dignitary harms. And we've seen that in some of the panels this morning. We're seeing that on college campuses. And there are claims that speech that makes people uncomfortable or that affects their dignity should be restricted. Now, as an American constitutional lawyer, I agree with Lee that the First Amendment position, namely that counter speech is a better remedy for hateful speech that causes indignity than removal, is the right response. But I think especially in light of these new pressures, I really have to express admiration for Monica and Juniper and their colleagues at Twitter, and also for Deborah Lauder at the ADL, because this is such an important group too. They are trying to thread an incredibly delicate and difficult line with all of these pressures from Europe and from society to take speech down and ban dignitary speech, and yet this constitutional principle that says it has to stay up unless it's intended to cause imminent violence. This is a hard thing to do. I really have concluded that if someone has to do it, I would rather that it be these two incredibly powerful women than a government like Europe or an international body like the illiberal groups that are calling for suppression of speech at the network level, led by China and Russia. So it's a messy, it's an inadequate solution. The American framers might have preferred a little bit more clarity and precision and separation of powers. But after thinking about this for a long time, I think that the balance that they're striking is a sensible one.
I have a follow-up for Lee, but Juniper, you want to jump in?
Just wanted to say one quick thing. Thank you, Jeff, for the praise, but I want to be clear that Monica and I represent huge teams at our respective companies who think deeply about these issues and are very involved in striking the right balance when it comes to these questions.
You know, people with power always deny it, but really, you are in fact more powerful than any Supreme Court justice.
I'm going to join Juniper on this one and outvote Jeff. But the other thing I would say is a lot of what we do is informed by external conversations that we have. We talk to, in addition to ACLU and ADL, we are regularly, every day, we are in conversations with groups around the world who tell us how certain issues are being perceived in their community, how issues are manifesting themselves online, and what their hopes are for how we can help keep their community safe on Facebook. So while we are responsible for overseeing these policies and managing them, it is really a global conversation that we're having.
Right, and I would add, they really have, we've seen the companies, initially I would say they were resistant to the issue, and over the years that we've been working with them in the Anti-Cyber Hate Working Group, we've come to see these companies as real partners in this fight and really appreciate it. So Lee, I want to get to you. I want you to comment on Jeff's points, because we see now this concept of power and who controls. Do we need rules to ensure that these companies don't have too much power? Like Are you worried about censorship and due process rights for those who
Of course.
material may be deleted?
Absolutely. And, I think we at ACLU have had our own account disabled because I had the temerity to write a blog that included an image of a topless bronze statue. And it was a political issue, and the reason it got taken down is because I was writing a critical blog about a citizen grand jury process, which if that doesn't make any sense to you, that's good, where citizens in Kansas were literally trying to indict a statue because the statue was topless in public. And so I
You
wrote
can go to Italy and get a box.
I
you
know, yeah,
yeah.
it would
Yeah.
probably not be a good international
Yeah.
trip for these folks. So I wrote a fairly jocular blog because I thought this was so ludicrous, right? I mean, I just couldn't think of a set of facts that kind of illustrated a lack of free speech values, and included a shot of the topless statue. And the folks who were engaged in that debate filed a lot of complaints to Facebook, and our entire account was shut down. Of course, our development people freaked out in the middle of the night, and we fixed it. And part of the reason we fixed it is because I knew who to call. And I felt like I had to write a follow-up blog saying we fixed it because I knew who to call. And I don't want to take that for granted, that the reason we knew why our account got taken down and the reason it got put back up is because we had the right people to email. And they are wonderful people to email. I agree with everything Jeff said. But for the average user, there's an incredible black space if your account is censored, if your account is taken down. And there really isn't. And look, I realize I'm speaking in aspirational terms, and we've just heard numbers like 400 hours of YouTube footage a minute and 1 million reports of violations a day on Facebook. So I'm not trying to be Pollyanna-ish about this. I realize that the volume makes this an unbelievable effort. But nonetheless, there's no due process, right? There's nothing that we think of as traditional due process. People don't clearly understand why their speech may have been taken down, whether it was based on a complaint, a kind of free-floating policy that they violated, and for most people there's no meaningful appeals process. And I think, look, I don't know that we need laws for that. I mean, Facebook and Google are private actors. They're gargantuan private actors, and we're facing private actors that are more controlling and pseudo-governmental in their norms and effects than we've ever dealt with, I think, as a society. But I don't think that changes the fact that that I think we do want these systems to generally be self-regulating and self-sustaining, but I think that incorporating a concept of due process and an appeal is good for users, it's good for business, especially in the United States where people are attached to this kind of First Amendment model of what speech means. And so I think, I'm not sure that we need new laws, but I certainly think that it's incumbent on companies who are engaged in this volume of censorship to give a lot of clarity to their users, because at the end of the day, they're platforms for speech. And I think it's ultimately not going to be a good business plan to have users who don't understand where that speech stops and why it got taken down. And the last thing I'll say is, for me, that points to focusing policies on where people are personally impacted and increasing user control, right? More tools to block people I don't like, to stop people from adding me on Twitter, from seeing people in my Facebook feed, because in that way we can control our own experience, avoid things that harass us, that upset us, without having a free-floating third-party takedown regime. And I think that's where, as with our blog, that's where the risks really come in, because you're incentivizing a heckler's veto. And we don't want that constitutionally, and I don't think we want it on platforms for speech, even when they're privately owned.
Okay. So Monica wanted to respond as well.
Yes, in case anybody in the room is inclined to post a picture of a naked statue, I feel compelled to point out that does not violate our policies. It was a mistake. And unfortunately, when you're dealing with over 1 million reports a day, even if you are able to maintain 99% accuracy, you're still going to have a lot of mistakes. And it's actually fortunate, as Lee points out, that this mistake was with the ACLU, because they could contact us directly. We do have an appeals process if your account has been closed. But one thing I want to say about that is we don't just rely on appeals. We are constantly doing quality audits. The reason we do that is because we understand we're going to have mistakes. And so we have a specific quality team within our community operations team. And anytime we have a mistake, They are addressing that with the person who made that mistake, and they're looking into it. They're also re-reviewing a subset of accounts every day to see how we're doing with our accuracy. And I can tell you, leading our policies, that often what that results in is us recognizing that a particular policy is not working well and providing additional guidance to our reviewers. That said, I think Lee's entirely right that what services need to focus on is being really transparent with people who are using the service and providing control. And this is we are working on this. We're trying to improve. In terms of transparency, the policies have to be really clear. We overhauled our policies about a year ago, it'll be a year ago in April, to provide a lot more information about what we mean by hate speech or bullying or harassment. And we're always working on providing more controls, more ability to block people that you don't want to see, or unfriend people, or remove certain posts from your news feed. And that's something that will continue to evolve as the product evolves.
Right. So as I mentioned earlier, the best practices we developed included a lot about giving the users easy mechanisms to flag material and this whole concept of transparency. And I think YouTube and Google have also done a particularly good job in terms of telling users how they make decisions and what comes down, and if you've had government requests for takedown. So Juniper, if you want to comment on that.
Thank you. So we also believe deeply in transparency and due process. We don't take lightly some of the concerns that Lee raised, which is why we were the first company to issue a transparency report around the legal removals I mentioned earlier, where when the government requests that we remove content based on local law, we publish that data in a transparency report multiple times a year. When it comes to the content policy removals, if you have a video removed from YouTube for violation of our community guidelines, you will get a notification from us informing you that a video was removed, which community guideline the video violates, with a link to a help center that provides more information, so that there's kind of an education loop for people who have posted content that is in violation of policies. We also are thinking hard about how to create more transparency. We do have due process mechanisms in place, including a robust appeals process. Even in the copyright realm, we invest heavily in making sure that there's a robust counter notice process that people are educated about. We have done a lot of work around fair use this year. So we do try to strike a balance to make sure that there's plenty of due process and transparency baked into how we approach this. It's something that we're in conversations with NGOs and governments about, because we believe that with this responsibility of setting the rules of the road for these platforms that people are really using in all kinds of innovative, amazing ways to share content around the world, that we do owe back some transparency around what we do with content that's uploaded to our services.
So, Jeff, I wanted to follow up the comment you made about what happens internationally. So, for those of you who are not aware, countries like Germany, Austria, post-Holocaust, put in very strict laws against anti-Semitism, xenophobia, racism. So, hate speech is definitely illegal, and there are consequences. People actually can go to prison. Are we looking now at here we were supposed to have a World Wide Web of communication. Are we looking at a system that, there's going to be different internets for different countries? What's going to be the answer to this?
I'm concerned not only about the possibility of a balkanization of the internet into different free speech zones, but into the possibility that the trend might be toward the constriction of free speech rather than its proliferation. So a couple of years ago, I kind of jokingly called for a sort of American free speech imperialism that would impose the American First Amendment standards that speech can only be restricted if it's intended to and likely to cause imminent violence on as many countries as is feasible, given the constraints that the platforms have to obey local laws. And that's because I think it's the right answer, and that, as Brandeis said, counter speech is a better solution than suppression. But we're seeing a trend internationally toward the greater and greater restriction of hate speech. And the best example of that is this new right to be forgotten that the European Court of Justice has imposed by judicial fiat. So the right to be forgotten comes from the French droit à l'oubli, or the right of oblivion, which is incredibly French. It's just sort of right out of Sartre, you know, I want to be forgotten, and Americans all want to be remembered. But this decision is extremely significant because it requires Google and Yahoo and other search engines to remove any speech that any internet user in Europe basically says offends their dignity, unless Google lawyers determine that the speech is necessary for scientific or public or artistic purposes. And if Google guesses wrong about whether or not a European privacy commissioner would find the speech to be protected, it's liable for fines of up to 2% of its annual income, which in Google's case last year was something like $60 billion per incident. So as you can imagine, this judicial ruling has concentrated Google's mind. It has no choice. It has to comply with this ruling because it's obliged to comply with all local and international laws. And as a result of this ruling, Google has received, Juniper may have the exact numbers, but hundreds of thousands of takedown requests, and it's complied with 40% of them. It has removed 40% of the requests in Europe to take down truthful but embarrassing speech. Notice this is not speech that is defamatory. It's not speech that is a true threat or incites violence. It's speech that some user finds to be offensive because it offends their dignity. So, for example, if someone right now were tweeting that I'm giving a boring talk or I'm going on too long in this answer, and we were in Europe, after the talk I could demand that Google remove this slanderous and outrageous and untrue post, and then Google lawyers would have to decide whether I'm a public figure and whether it's necessary for public discourse. If they guessed wrong, that's, you know, millions of dollars in potential fines. So I think this is troubling. Many of these takedown requests have involved public figures. The BBC has a list of the links that it's been required to take down, and some of them remove speech that would unquestionably be protected under the First Amendment, which would be considered very much of public interest. And generally, the American free speech tradition, embodied by the great Justice Louis Brandeis, has concluded that judges and regulators and even really smart, wonderful Google lawyers, who, again, I have to say, are doing about as good a job with this unwelcome task as could be imagined, that these officials should not be entrusted with the task of deciding what kind of speech the public should be interested in. That, in the American tradition, is something that we the people have to decide for ourselves. And I mentioned that in America today, on college campuses and elsewhere, we're seeing growing calls for the suppression of speech that causes indignity and hurt feelings, and without in any way diminishing the real pain that speech can cause. I think this is a troubling Europeanization of the free speech discourse, and I am concerned that given the obligation that these companies have to obey local laws, if American laws are expanded to allow for the suppression of speech, if harassment laws, for example, and courts are grappling with this, this is the big free speech versus dignity question right now that many of this audience are engaged in. If harassment laws on campus and elsewhere are expanded to allow for the suppression of speech, truthful but embarrassing speech that causes dignitary harms, I'm afraid that we may go the way of Europe. So we're at a crossroads. I don't mean to be a Pollyanna about this. I think if anyone has to strike this balance, this group is, has my vote. I think they're doing as well as can be done. But as a society and as a globe, we have to decide, what do we value ultimately more, privacy and dignity or free expression? That is a hard choice, but if forced to choose, I vote for free expression.
Right.
Deborah, can I follow up on that?
Sure. Yeah, I was just going to comment, and then I'll give Lee. It's a very difficult problem, for us in the Jewish community when we're experiencing a wave of very serious global anti-Semitism. The communities in France, Austria, Belgium, who are really seeing so much hate on the internet and feeling it's translating into real violence, are saying, we need to shut it down, and you guys have to help us do that. And of course, we come at the same perspective of, the answer is more speech, that we need to counter it with more speech, more education. But it's a real tense issue for the communities around the world today. So go ahead, Lee.
I generally agree with Jeff, but I saw a rare opportunity to maybe disagree a tiny bit, so I had to take it. Which is, Columbia hosts a really spectacular Global Freedom of Expression conference. It's pretty new, but it's really, really great, Columbia Law School. And at last year's conference, I was pretty astounded when I was sitting at a pretty big banquet table of European scholars who I would say, I think it's fair to say, had a near universal consensus that the right to be forgotten was in part a reaction to American values as displayed through Google searches. And that basically these European scholars of expression believed that there was a real knee-jerk reaction by Europeans to basically Google's search algorithm that they believed prized too much, kind of nitty-gritty news about arrests, right? Mugshots, sex. I mean, we do have a pretty salacious set of public concerns in America. So I absolutely believe, I'm such a true believer in exporting our values, but I do think we have to be careful to do it in a way that isn't imperial, because I do think it risks a real reaction that actually exceeds that, and I think part of the right to be forgotten is a reaction to our values, and one I understand. And the other thing I'll say is that, you know, to bring it back to what you asked, Deborah, about passing new laws, I will say that one thing we haven't mentioned is that terms of service, right? Violations of terms of service provide an opportunity for third-party takedown, even where that person is not personally affected. That person may be a government, right? So by having censorship rules that are lower than the First Amendment, right, that have a lower threshold for speech, we can give a huge signal boost to repressive governments by enabling them to report terms of service violations and get speech taken down. That's a really interesting combination of public and private action there, right? It's the government bootstrapping on private policies to get stuff taken down. So the one area I will say I would love to see laws is to prevent at least American government officials and law enforcement from making terms of service takedown requests. I think that is un-American, and it's a really crummy way of pretending we have a First Amendment, but using private terms of service violations to undermine those protections. And I think that's an area where Google, Facebook, and Twitter can all do better in their transparency reports by reporting which terms of service violations that they are aware of knowingly come from governments, and very specifically American government agents.
Okay. So we're going to turn to the audience in just a second, but I think I'll give Monica her right to counter speech.
I think Jeff has pointed out some of the difficulties in the global landscape when we think about speech so differently around the world. One of the ways that we respond to that is by trying to empower the community to speak up against hate and harassment. Juniper said it earlier, the problem is not the hateful posts, the problem is the underlying hate. And we know, from working at Facebook, I can tell you, the vast majority of the 1.6 billion people using Facebook are using it for good purposes. So if we can mobilize that community to stand up when they see something hateful, that's really, number one, how you make people feel safe on the platform, and number two, how you assuage the fears, especially in governments around the world, about speech and the dangers of legislation that might hamper speech that could be that might be important for the political debate. So we have been working alongside Google to try to empower people in the community to stand up. Part of that means lowering barriers so that people feel like there is a value in them participating. We're working with groups like Affinis Labs to run hackathons that bring together people from different groups of society to talk about hate speech and how they can combat it. And they come up with these really innovative projects that we're happy to support. We're also providing tools through the site that allow people to, in an easy way, contact somebody that they think has posted something inappropriate. And we give them, in collaboration with language researchers from Yale and Berkeley, we give them suggested language that they can use to say to somebody, I really don't appreciate this posted, maybe you should remove it. So we're trying to facilitate that good speech that will hopefully alleviate some of the concerns globally.
Great, thank you. So a lot of fodder here for discussion. You know, the frustration is always that we could go on for another hour or two, but if there are any questions from the audience, are there microphones out there? Facilitating?
I'm close by.
If you could identify yourself and maybe where you're from.
Hi, my name is Cynthia Lowen. I've actually spoken with some of you on the panel. I'm from New York. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I feel like, several of you have alluded to protected groups or special groups. And I feel like the kind of elephant in the room is civil rights. And obviously, Facebook's definition for hate speech is derived directly from our civil rights code. And, it's like, I think that this conversation is happening today at a panel or a summit on online harassment is because this speech isn't just sort of in a vacuum of, what you should be allowed to say or shouldn't or whatever, but how it impacts the targets of that speech. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about where you see the intersection between hate speech, the First Amendment, and our Civil Rights Code.
Thank you. Who wants to?
I'm happy to. I don't want to dominate, but I'm
No,
happy to.
that's fine.
Well, I started out by using some examples of people calling Black Lives Matter, the movement, as something that is either itself or closely related to hate speech for a reason. And it is that, look, I work for a civil rights organization, the ACLU. I consider myself a progressive free speech feminist, and I don't think that those are incompatible in any way. And the reason is because I believe there is a real risk, and history has demonstrated this, that when we give the government more power to protect the marginalized, it can backfire, right? That if we pass hate crimes laws, for example, consistently the FBI reports that for both Black Americans and LGBTQ Americans that they are overcharged compared to their percentage in the general population, right? So although Black Americans are not anywhere near 20% of the population, they are over 20% of the people charged with hate crimes. So my concern is that even those who have really good intentions, right, when it comes to speech, we do have a system that is itself that has entrenched biases, and I think we have policies and laws that try and fix that. But when it comes to speech, when you give the government, which may be a flawed system, more power, I don't think any of us should be surprised that that power is sometimes used against those very exact marginalized communities that we're hoping and trying to protect. And I think speech creates that risk more greatly than any other type of rule or law because there is so much of the impact that is felt by the listener, and there's a subjectivity to it that I think permits people in power to turn it right back around on the very marginalized people that we're trying to protect. And so I know there's been a lot of kind of free speech as a proxy for this conservative kind of white male libertarianism, particularly on campus. I mean, there was literally one campus where free speech posters were literally deemed hate speech, okay? And I think that's a totally false equivalency. And I think anyone who believes that free speech and civil rights are incompatible either was not alive or was not awake during the civil rights movement. And I think there might be a complacency for many people because they might see us living in a relatively civilized world. But I personally do not trust the government to be making those decisions, and I certainly don't trust the government to be using additional power on behalf of marginalized groups. I actually believe that groups like Facebook and Google are better at doing that. And so I think it is better to help create that environment where people feel safe. But again, I think those policies should be focused not on free-floating words we don't say, not on free-floating ideas that bother us, but on giving users control so they can control what they see, and on focusing policies that are personally impacting people, harassment, threats, where you are a victim rather than someone who doesn't want to hear something. And I think if that is our general trend, we can both protect free speech and have a community where people of color, other marginalized people can participate freely and control their own experience. And that's better than giving more power to people to decide who's marginalized and what words hurt the most.
So thank you, Lee. So as a moderator prerogative, I have to tell you the ADL is the organization that drafted the hate speech laws that most states rely on today, and we led the coalition to pass hate crimes. So Lee and I will engage in another forum at a different time on that very important topic. I think we have time for one more question from audience.
My name is Michael. I'm an editor of a German daily newspaper, and we've been having an issue, of course, with hate speech, especially on Facebook, because of the refugee crisis and migrants coming to Germany, coming to Europe. My question to you, Monica, maybe is, first of all, how many people really scan the reports, the million reports that are coming to your company, and how many people really react on it? And the second question, if you're able to to develop an algorithm, for example, to identify new slang words on Facebook posts and do something with that? Why can't you develop an algorithm identifying hate posts, hate speech?
Great question. In terms of the way that we staff our community operations team, that's the team that's responsible for reviewing posts, it's a complicated answer because we have reviewers in several dozen languages, and we have to ensure, like Juniper mentioned, coverage 24/7 around the globe. And so the number fluctuates a little bit. I don't have a hard number for you, but the number is based on maintaining a very fast turnaround time around the globe in dozens of languages. The question that you asked about an automated way or an algorithm for detecting hate speech, we get that question a lot. We get it. I mentioned earlier that we engage with a lot of external groups, and we get that conversation a lot. And part of it is you've got all these world-class engineers working on ways to improve Facebook and to use automation and artificial intelligence. Why can't you do this proactively and perfectly? And the reason is because when it comes to hate speech, it is so contextual. And that's true for actually a lot of areas of policy, whether it's bullying or harassment or even threats. You can be joking with a friend and you can say, if you don't come to my party tomorrow night, I am going to kill you. And that is something that we need to have real people looking at. When it comes to hate speech, there are, for instance, words that can be used, slurs that can be used to attack people that we would want to remove. However, somebody might also use that slur to say, this morning on the subway, somebody called me this word. It was horrifying. And we want that people to be able to engage in that person to be able to engage in that speech. So we do feel like, maybe there will be a day in the future where automation can really help us with that. But right now, we really feel like it's important for people to look at that and make a decision.
Thank you, Monica. So I think we're getting right at the end. I want to conclude by saying when ADL looks at this, the enormity of the problem today, there's three things that we believe can be done. One is to find these reasoned, measured, effective way for the users and the industry to work together, to have these kinds of discussions, to get it out in the open, get the difficult decision points, and work as a team. The second is getting more companies in the industry to endorse the best practices and to set down this kind of value system that we've been talking about. And the third is really getting the community of users to use their voice, to do exactly what Monica and Juniper have been talking about in terms of counter speech and raising our voices. So for those of you who are here today, we appreciate that you want to engage in this kind of dialogue. And I think I'm getting the signal that it's time. So I think the panelists will probably stick around for a little bit if you have individual questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to those of you at the microphone. But this whole issue is not going away. It's a challenge, and I really, really appreciate, and I hope you agree with me, that having these thoughtful, powerful people, women and men, grappling with them is enormously gratifying that we can do this together. So thank you all for attending today.